Something has already been decided behind the scenes, and the strange part is that you may have been feeling its presence before you ever knew what to call it. Somewhere during these past few days, quietly and without any dramatic announcement, an answer has taken shape in writing. It has not reached you yet, but it exists. It is finished. It is sealed. It is waiting on the other side of a barrier so thin that you could almost mistake it for nothing at all. And yet some part of you can already sense its outline, as though you are a printer who can somehow feel the weight of a headline before the final page ever leaves the press. This Saturday, August the 15th, two planets press directly against that invisible barrier at the same precise moment. Mercury, the planet connected with language, communication, thought, editing, negotiation, and the delivery of information, meets Jupiter, the planet that expands whatever it touches and carries a message far beyond the place where it began. They meet at 10 degrees and 9 minutes of Leo, under a sky already filled with the bright presence of the sun. And when that meeting reaches its exact point, the barrier gives way. But before we talk about every degree or every aspect, there is one question that sits underneath this entire moment, and it is a question you may already have been asking yourself without realizing it. If the answer has already been decided, why does everything still feel as though the outcome depends completely on what you choose to do? The answer is both simple and complicated. It depends on you, and it does not depend on you. The space between those two truths is where your yes is being formed right now, and that is the space we are stepping into together. Maybe you have been carrying one sentence inside your mind for days, perhaps weeks, perhaps even longer. You may never have spoken it aloud. You may not even have admitted to yourself how important it has become. But somewhere beneath the surface, the same thought keeps returning. It could be an argument you need to make, a confession you have been postponing, a request you are afraid to place in front of someone, or a quiet permission you have been trying to give yourself. You construct the sentence one way, then mentally erase it. You change a word. You imagine the reaction. You make it softer, then stronger. Then you start all over again. The meaning is already there, but the language still does not feel capable of carrying the weight of what you truly mean. If you have been following the energy of this week, you may have already noticed the shift. Wednesday eclipse brought something into view that was not necessarily comfortable to see. It revealed something about who you are, or perhaps about who you have been becoming, and it made avoidance much harder. Now the question has changed. You are no longer simply asking, "Who am I?" In some way, you have already answered that. The deeper question is whether what you have discovered matters enough to be spoken, and if it does, who needs to hear it? For one person, that could be a conversation that has been rehearsed so many times that the words have become almost worn out. For someone else, it could be a price that has never been stated clearly, a boundary that has remained lightly sketched because putting it into permanent language feels frightening. It could even be something deeply private that you have no intention of telling anyone, a decision that simply needs to become real inside your own mind before this week ends. It might involve an employer, a partner, an audience, or a family member who needs to encounter the version of you that is no longer hiding behind an edited story. This movement from private thought into spoken language is exactly what gives this weekend its significance. But remember something important as we move forward. There is one day in this entire sequence that quietly reveals whether your yes has substance or whether it was simply an emotional feeling that fades once the intensity passes. That day is not Saturday. We will return to it, because once you understand which day it is and what the sky is doing at that moment, the entire architecture of this week becomes easier to understand. For now, return to the single sentence you have been turning over in your mind. Not the enormous life vision, not the entire future, just the sentence. Maybe it is the application you have written 3 times without pressing send. Maybe it is the conversation you keep replaying while driving with the window open and no one beside you. Maybe it is the unfinished message sitting inside your notes application. Maybe it is the subject line you have rewritten again and again because you cannot decide which version sounds like the real you. Whatever shape your sentence has taken, that is your draft. And this weekend, that draft moves toward publication. Mercury is the messenger at the doorway. Mercury names things. Mercury edits them. Mercury sends them. Mercury negotiates between people and connects one thought to another. Jupiter does something different. Jupiter takes a message and gives it reach. It adds meaning. It increases its consequence. It asks why the message matters beyond the immediate room and why the story deserves to become larger than the moment in which it was created. When these two planets meet, something that once seemed small can suddenly receive permission to become significant. A thought can become a direction. A private draft can become a public declaration. They meet this Saturday at 10 degrees and 9 minutes of Leo. And Leo matters because Leo is solar. Leo wants a face, a name, a signature, a voice, a presence that does not apologize for existing. The sun is also in Leo on Saturday, so this is not simply a stage that has been prepared. The stage is illuminated. Mercury, Jupiter, and the sun are gathered together in Leo, creating an atmosphere that favors visibility rather than secrecy. This is energy that wants to be seen and expressed, not whispered from the corner of the room. Mercury entered Leo less than a week ago, which means this voice is still relatively new. It has not been sitting comfortably in its new position for a long time. It is newly strengthened. It belongs to someone who has just moved out of excessive analysis and into a warmer, bolder, more personal way of speaking. That freshness is part of its power. The words have not yet had enough time to become empty performance. They are still close to what they actually mean. 3 days before this conjunction, a new moon formed in Leo and planted a fresh intention. That intention carried themes of creative courage, visibility, and the willingness to be seen more honestly than before. The conjunction does not plant that seed. The seed was already planted. Instead, the conjunction gives the seed a title, a philosophy, and a wider audience. It takes something small but authentic and moves it toward the front page. Imagine every important piece of information beginning as a private note, something written quietly in the margin where nobody else can see it. It stays there until someone decides that the note deserves to be developed, that the idea deserves to be composed, and that the message deserves to reach people who may not have known they needed it. That is what Saturday does to your message. It gives the private note a wider circulation. And when the conjunction becomes exact, the moon is in Virgo, the sign associated with editing, precision, refinement, fact-checking, and the instinct to examine whether the story actually holds together when placed under close observation. Later that same Saturday, the moon moves into Libra, and the atmosphere changes again. The emphasis moves from refinement toward sharing, from asking whether the message works toward asking whether the message reaches another person. First, you examine the language. Then you consider the relationship created by the language. The story was never written in one sitting. That is the part no one else will see when Saturday arrives. The yes that finally moves through the barrier did not appear suddenly. It was drafted, challenged, edited, and revised through an entire week of Mercury aspects. Each aspect placed another layer on the same page. Some of those layers may have felt surprisingly heavy. Perhaps your thoughts have been louder than usual. Perhaps one conversation affected you much more deeply than you expected. Perhaps something you believed you had already resolved returned wearing a different face and asking the same old question from a new angle. If any of that has happened, there may have been more beneath the experience than ordinary stress. You were revising something internally, whether you recognized it or not, and the final message becomes stronger because of those revisions. 5 days before the conjunction, Mercury squared Chiron. Think of that as the first difficult draft, the version in which the sentence itself hurts. The fear of being judged, misunderstood, rejected, or exposed could rise suddenly and place a hand across the page. If you experienced hesitation this week, if you felt yourself pulling back before you could even finish forming the words, Chiron was asking a deeper question. Do you care about this truth enough to speak it even when speaking it makes you vulnerable? 4 days before the conjunction, Mercury opposed Pluto. This was the deeper cut. Something hidden could rise into view. A power dynamic could become impossible to ignore. A truth you had been turning over privately could suddenly demand recognition. A conversation could expose how quickly control and vulnerability can change places. Pluto does not usually offer gentle editing. Pluto searches for the line you buried and brings it back to the surface, then waits to see whether you will cross it out again or finally allow it to remain. On that same day, Mercury trined Neptune. After the confrontation came another kind of opening. Imagination returned. The story gained emotional color, symbolism, intuition, and a sense that the meaning could not be contained by facts alone. If something inside you softened on that day, if an image, dream, feeling, or intuitive realization communicated something that logic could not explain, that was the Neptune layer of the process. Neptune added the emotional paragraph, the part of the story that makes someone pause because they suddenly feel rather than merely understand. 3 days before the conjunction, Mercury sextiled Uranus. That was the breakthrough. The framing changed. An old assumption cracked. A connection appeared that had not been visible the day before. You may have experienced a moment when everything suddenly rearranged itself around a fresher, stranger, more honest center. That is the kind of opening Uranus represents. It offered you a better way to begin than the one you had been forcing yourself to use. Every movement across this astrological sequence brought you closer to a version of the truth capable of surviving exposure. Chiron made you hesitate. Pluto made you look directly at what you had buried. Neptune returned feeling and imagination to the story. Uranus showed you that the frame you were using had become too small for what you actually needed to say. None of these revisions were necessarily comfortable, but each one had a purpose. That is the honest center of this entire sequence. The yes you are moving toward carries more weight because it came after you confronted the difficult truth, not before. Good news that arrives before the difficult conversation can sometimes feel like temporary reassurance. Good news that remains standing after the difficult conversation has a different quality. It becomes durable. It becomes something you can trust because it survived contact with what was real. The language now begins to soften into something more coherent and balanced. Today, Thursday, the day when the message begins to reach you, Mercury sextiles Venus. This is one of the cleanest aspects in the entire build-up when it comes to tone. It brings grace, receptivity, and greater social ease. The draft that may have previously felt too raw, too blunt, or too consumed by its own emotional history can finally begin to sound natural. The request can preserve dignity on both sides. The words no longer need to fight one another. Venus entered Libra 7 days ago, and since then she has wrapped this entire story in diplomacy and a more favorable relational atmosphere. That means your message does not have to arrive as an ultimatum or demand. It can arrive as an invitation. It can be warm without becoming weak. It can be precise without becoming cold. It can be generous enough that the person receiving it actually wants to lean closer and listen. So use today for the warm introduction. Use it for the carefully written email. Use it for the conversation where you finally begin with what you truly need instead of burying the important sentence beneath 6 paragraphs of explanation. Whatever form your answer takes, whether it is a response, an application, a confession, an argument, or a quiet boundary, today is about changing the way the message lands. It is not about forcing the peak. The peak is still 2 days away. Today is about refining the headline. And if what you are holding is not an external request at all, but an internal permission, then today matters just as much. Perhaps you have been waiting for someone else to approve a choice that only you can authorize. Perhaps the yes you need is private, something no audience will ever see. Then let today become the moment when your own language becomes gentle enough for you to hear it without immediately retreating. Some of the softest requests we ever make are also the bravest. This is where the metaphor begins to become tangible. If you have been searching for the right way to phrase something, a title for a project, a subject line for an email, or a single sentence that could finally open a conversation you have been avoiding, the Mercury-Venus sextile today supports the kind of language that actually lands. Use that atmosphere before Saturday amplifies everything. Remember that the day that truly tests whether the headline can carry the story is still ahead. And now the entire meaning of this sequence turns on one final realization. Return to the wall from the beginning, that nearly invisible barrier between the sealed answer and the world outside it. You may have been standing there as though someone on the other side holds the final decision, as though your role is simply to wait for permission to move. But the sealed message behind that wall carries your own handwriting. Mercury and Jupiter are not choosing its content for you. They are not creating the yes. They are not deciding what your truth should be. What they can do this Saturday is amplify what you have already written, giving your words enough strength and reach to travel through the room and enter the part of life where they must actually land. The answer may already be decided, but it was decided by you, not for you. And that distinction is what turns this moment from passive waiting into conscious recognition. You are not standing at the wall because you have no power. You are standing there because you are about to discover that the message you were waiting to receive has, in some deeper sense, already been written by the person you have been becoming all week. The next part of the story is what happens when that message finally moves beyond the private space where you created it. Do not mistake what is happening now for a verdict that is coming down from the heavens, because you are not standing outside some mysterious gate waiting for the universe to decide your future for you. The decision has already been shaped by you through every difficult thought you were willing to face, every uncomfortable truth you allowed yourself to examine, every imagined possibility that helped you see beyond the limits of your fear, and every moment when you chose a gentler way to express what was real inside you. You have been writing this answer for longer than you may realize. Pain gave it depth, imagination helped you reshape it, and grace taught you how to deliver it without turning your truth into a weapon. Saturday, August the 15th, is not the day the sky suddenly creates your answer. It is the day your answer begins to travel. It is the moment when the words you have privately carried begin to receive more reach, more confidence, more visibility, and a wider audience than they had at the beginning of this week. But I want to slow this down, because there is something important about this moment that can easily be misunderstood. Mercury and Jupiter meet in a conjunction like this approximately once every year. That makes the timing meaningful, but it does not make this a once-in-a-generation alignment, and it is not an extraordinarily rare planetary event. The eclipse that occurred earlier this week carries the rarer quality. This conjunction is different. It is less dramatic in spectacle, but for you personally it may be far more practical. It is not necessarily a cosmic explosion that changes everything without your participation. It is more like a door opening while you are already standing with your hand near the handle. It gives movement to something you have already prepared. It provides momentum to something that has already been developing. It offers a useful opening that can actually be worked with. And that distinction matters, because the true significance of this Mercury-Jupiter conjunction does not come from rarity. Its importance comes from everything that happened before it. Think about the difficult conversation. Think about the moment when something suddenly became clear. Think about the language you softened, because you realized that being honest did not require being harsh. Think about the fresh intention planted by the new moon in Leo. All of those moments were preparing the same message. Your message needed more than excitement. It needed honesty. It needed to survive your own scrutiny before it could carry meaning for anyone else. Now that the honesty has been placed inside the message, Jupiter can perform the function it understands so naturally. It can enlarge the room. It can take something that existed only within your private emotional space and give it greater context, greater reach, and greater consequence. This is why Saturday can favor a wider perspective, a larger audience, an encouraging response, a decision that suddenly feels more confident and consequential, an argument that travels farther than expected, or a conversation that restores your belief in a direction you had begun to question. It can also represent something much quieter. It could be an internal permission becoming strong enough to finally be spoken aloud. It could be a sentence that reaches the exact person who needed to hear it. It could look like an application finding its way to the right office. It could be a proposal delivered to someone who was already willing to listen. It could be a lesson leaving your hands and reaching someone you might never have encountered if you had not found the courage to press publish. And perhaps none of those external events describe your experience. Perhaps your moment is entirely private. Perhaps you simply wake up one day and realize that a word has finally settled inside your chest. It no longer feels unstable. It no longer needs constant explanation. You do not need another person to confirm it before you can believe it. You simply know. That can be just as meaningful. But there is another side of this conjunction that you must understand, because astrology becomes misleading when every encouraging aspect is treated as a promise of a perfect outcome. This alignment does not guarantee that every response will be yes. It does not announce that the journey is finished. It does not promise that enthusiasm alone will carry the responsibility that comes afterward. Saturday is an invitation to begin. It is the opening page, not the completed edition. The day of publication starts the story, but it does not write the ending for you. In fact, there is something much more empowering about that than any guarantee from the sky could ever be. Your life is not being handed back to you as a finished manuscript. You are being given the opportunity to build what comes next. That is why a genuine yes has to survive Monday morning. Remember the day I mentioned earlier. The day that quietly reveals whether your yes has substance or whether it was only an emotional surge created by the atmosphere of the weekend. That day is not Saturday. It is Monday, August 17th, 2 days after the conjunction. And what happens in the sky that morning may be one of the most revealing parts of this entire sequence. Mercury trines Saturn. This is where inspiration meets structure. This is where an idea that felt beautiful in your mind is asked to become something that can actually function in the real world. Saturn is not impressed merely because the headline sounds powerful. Saturn wants to know what happens next. Saturn asks whether there is a deadline. Is there a plan? Is there a budget? Is there a practical next step? Is there a name attached to the responsibility? Is there actual work behind the beautiful idea? Mercury trine. Saturn gives your yes a container. It gives it a schedule. It gives it a framework. It asks your words to become accountable to reality. That is where you discover whether the yes was simply a feeling or whether it can become a commitment. And on that same day, Venusile Jupiter preserves the goodwill and relational warmth surrounding you. The support is still present. The encouragement is still available. There is still a sense that something in the environment wants to cooperate rather than resist. But Monday also carries Mars square Neptune, and this is where the atmosphere becomes more complicated. Imagine waking up and seeing a road that looked perfectly clear the night before, only to discover that mist has moved across it by morning. The road has not disappeared. The destination has not necessarily changed, but visibility is lower. Mars square Neptune can create exactly that kind of experience. Energy can scatter. Action can become less precise. Motivation can drift. The impulse to move forward may still be strong, while the direction itself feels uncertain. You may suddenly question what seemed obvious only days earlier. You may feel impatient with the practical details. You may want to act simply to escape the discomfort of not knowing exactly what comes next. This is the real test. A durable yes can survive Monday morning. A pleasant emotional high may dissolve under the pressure of reality. If Saturday gives your story its opening page, Monday asks whether the story has a spine. It asks whether the title still makes sense after the adrenaline fades and the practical questions begin arriving. It asks whether you can remain committed when the experience is no longer emotionally spectacular. That is a much deeper form of confirmation than a temporary rush of excitement. Monday reveals whether you are willing to continue when the work becomes ordinary. It reveals whether your decision still belongs to you when nobody is applauding. And there is another checkpoint you need to know about. 6 days after the conjunction, Venus opposes Saturn. This becomes another durability test. The terms become more concrete. The stakes become easier to see. Warmth encounters responsibility. What felt easy in an emotionally open moment now has to stand beside limits, obligations, and real consequences. What remains standing after that encounter is much more likely to represent the yes that was genuinely yours. What dissolves may have been borrowed, enthusiasm wearing your name. And that is not a punishment. It is clarification. A yes that can look directly at responsibility without immediately retreating is a yes that deserves your trust. The purpose of a durability test is not to destroy hope. It is to separate what was always authentic from what was temporarily fueled by a beautiful afternoon, an emotional high, or the desire to believe that everything would suddenly become effortless. What survives becomes cleaner. It becomes simpler. It becomes more distinctly yours. This is why I want you to do something that may matter more than any aspect we have discussed. Before you finish writing the full message, before you rehearse the entire conversation again, say your yes aloud. Say one sentence into an empty room. No audience, no performance, no one waiting to praise you, just your own voice carrying the words back to you. Listen carefully to what happens inside you when you hear yourself say it. If the sentence sounds true in your own voice, without requiring you to reach for some grander word or dramatic explanation, then it is ready for the expansion of Saturday. You are not trying to convince yourself. You are listening for recognition. Then choose one morning during the following week, any morning, and say the same sentence again. Same words, same room, same honesty. That second moment is the commitment check. One sentence and one morning. The sentence is the headline. The morning is the fact check. If the words still feel true and the room is quiet and the excitement has cooled, then you have something worthy of your name, your effort, and your time. This is how you distinguish a real decision from an emotional reaction. You do not need to make it louder. You need to see whether it remains true when the emotional temperature changes. And there is one more thing I want you to remember about Monday. Do not interpret the fog of Mars square Neptune as evidence that your yes was wrong. Confusion is not always contradiction. Sometimes uncertainty is simply the experience of moving from inspiration into implementation. Mars square Neptune can test patience without delivering a final judgment on the value of what you chose. At the same time, Mercury trine Saturn gives your mind the discipline required to make a clear plan even while your body may feel restless or scattered. Think carefully, move slowly. Put the plan on paper before you try to execute it. Let structure do what excitement cannot do. This is where you return to the central metaphor. You are holding the pen. The wall was never positioned between you and somebody else's verdict. The wall existed between two versions of the same message. One version was the private version, protected and contained, kept safely inside the room where you originally wrote it. The other version is the one that has permission to exist beyond that room, where other people can hear it, respond to it, challenge it, receive it, or connect with it. That is the wall. That is what begins to crack on Saturday. Mercury and Jupiter in Leo do not destroy that barrier because the universe has issued a decree in your favor. They weaken it because your own words, after a week of difficult drafts, honest confrontations, quiet revisions, and emotional refinement, have finally become strong enough to travel. The barrier gives way because the message is ready. Pain edited it. Imagination expanded it. Grace softened it. And now you have to decide what you will do with the opening. Say the biggest true thing you can honestly say. Ask for the opening if there is something you genuinely need to ask for. Receive encouragement when it comes. But do not treat encouragement as proof that the entire journey is already complete. Let it be evidence that the direction is real and that the voice speaking, it belongs to you. Then build something worthy of the promise. Do not automatically choose the biggest thing. Do not choose the loudest thing. Choose the thing that carries your name with integrity. Choose the thing that still makes sense after the printing ends and ordinary work begins. The story does not become complete simply because its first reader sees it. A second edition only becomes meaningful after the story has been lived long enough for evidence to revise it. That is the difference between excitement and experience. The publication day is not the finish line. It is the first morning when the headline becomes visible. It is the first day when your words have to survive questions they did not write for themselves. It is a good morning. It is a morning worth preparing for. You do not need to perform certainty if certainty is not what you feel. You need to trust that a message shaped by honesty, tested through vulnerability, and refined through a difficult week has earned the right to be heard. You do not need to shout. Leo at its best is not about volume. It is about warmth. It is the kind of presence that draws people closer instead of pushing them toward the edges of the room. That is the strength available here. And then pay attention to what follows, because the sequence does not simply end once Saturday arrives. Sunday, the day after Saturday, brings Mars into a quincunx with Pluto, creating a difficult adjustment that quietly reminds you that even after a yes has been articulated, the days afterward may require patience. A decision can be settled in language while your actions still need to move carefully. The headline has been released. Now let the response come toward you instead of chasing it down the street with another draft. Do not immediately rewrite what you have already said simply because the silence afterward makes you nervous. Give the message room to breathe. Give other people room to respond. Give yourself room to discover what the next practical step actually is. If this entire sequence has touched something personal in you, then let your own sentence become the evidence. Say the one sentence that represents the yes you are willing to stand behind. The yes that survives your own voice. The yes that still sounds true when no one else is present to validate it. The pen is still in your hand. The anchor is still fresh. What you write next belongs between you and the page. And perhaps the most important realization is that the first sentence is not waiting somewhere outside you to be discovered. It is already forming inside you, waiting for the moment when you finally trust yourself enough to let it become visible.